Hello, everyone out there, and welcome to another episode of the Practical Prepper Podcast. My name is Nick, and we have a great episode for you today. We have Fred joining us, who is a very, very experienced hiker, and he goes over all kinds of stuff from the very basics to walking styles to footwear choices, food choices, water purification, all that kind of stuff. We'll get right into it, and I hope you enjoy. So, Fred, how are you, my friend?
Hey, I'm doing great, Nick. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to do this.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. Hiking is something that I feel like a lot of people use the term, but they don't really know what it is. Like I was at a friend's son's birthday party yesterday, and there was two people, and this actually happened. I'm not just making this up for the sake of the podcast. These two people left, and we're like, "Oh, where are you going?" I'm like, "Oh, we're going hiking," and they leave, and they have no gear. They might have like a half-drank water bottle, and they're in Vans and like a Patagonia jacket. Like, to you, is that even hiking, or do you think people use the term hiking like way too loosely?
I think it's a loose term, but what is hiking? I mean, hiking is what? Walking? You're walking maybe somewhere with a destination in mind, typically in the wilderness, right? And I've debated that with some of my friends actually while hiking. And we're like, well, are we really going for a walk, or are we hiking? And then we get into, well, is this hiking, or is this technically now backpacking? And does it need to be overnight to be backpacking? So it's a fun conversation, but I think this, the activity lends itself to that kind of free-spiritedness, to whatever you really want to call it. Because it's really an activity that you're kind of making beyond the fact that you may have some pre-designated trails to follow. You're really deciding, hey, what is it that I'm going to try to go out and do or try and see today or over the next few days? And you kind of see what comes along the trail.
Well, that's interesting that's how you view it, that somebody is an avid hiker. Because I always wondered that. I was like, should I, if you're just going for a trail walk, like, am I hiking? Should I just say that I'm walking? When I say that I'm going hiking, does it sound ridiculous? But I'm sure we'll get to cover all that in all of its glory.
Well, I'm sure some people that play really hardcore sports, be that football or whatever it is, and they go and they ask, "Oh, do you do any sports?" Well, yeah, I like to hike. And they look at that and they're like, how the heck is that a sport?
Yeah. But it is, very physically demanding. I've never done any like backpacking or overnight hikes, but I've set out on ones that were, 4 hours out, 4 hours back in type of thing. And if you aren't prepared for that type of thing, it could be bad.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're setting yourself up for misery. If you've never, done something like that and then suddenly go out for 4 hours and back in, and you're not taking some of the kind of the creature comforts that will make, the difference between it being a painful experience and maybe just being a nice, a strenuous day, but, it's still enjoyable. Yeah.
All right. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into hiking and all that good stuff?
So I started walking, as just with the Cub Scouts. We would set these really short-term trips. The parents planned everything. We just go out in the woods, and typically we didn't know where we were, except we were out in the woods and people were showing us all kinds of cool stuff with worms and roots and everything. Mm-hmm. But the point behind those type of hikes was really to get us engaged as kids. Not so much about it being a sport, but more about showing us some appreciation for being out and how to slow down and take in things around you. And I only did that for a couple of years, but what I ended up doing is getting into a group called the Young Marines, it's kind of like a group that is sponsored by the armed forces here in the States. And they actually have real enlisted personnel or retired personnel that will come and instruct the youth in a variety of things. And one of them was hiking and backpacking. And so I did that for a few years in my teens and got exposure to like survival training, like how to go out in the woods and take a knife, a tarp, and maybe half a pack of matches and try to keep yourself fed for a few days. Yeah. It was fun. I guess that's the best way to say it. It was fun. Often by day 3, we were half starved, but no one ever got seriously injured. And it showed us another way of being out there in the woods. And then things kind of just dropped off, and it became hitting the metro parks as a teenager just to get away from the noise and, to something to do after school, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And as I got into my early 20s, I was living pretty close to the Cuyahoga Valley here. And there's a gorgeous network of trails running through there. Most people know about the bike and hike trail and the towpath trails. What they don't realize is we've got a gigantic trail that connects practically all 4 states of Ohio called the Buckeye Trail, and that runs right through the valley. And that is a trail that you can make nice loop hikes out of, where you don't have to walk out from point A to point B and then directly back to point A,
Yeah.
covering the same ground. And instead you can make the loop hikes where you're not recovering ground. And it's easy to go out there and make a 5-mile hike or a 22-mile hike, whatever you really feel feel like doing for the day.
Wow.
So I did that a lot in my early 20s, and then finally said, okay, I want to buy some gear. And I got a little catalog and bought some gear through the mail and started heading out into the woods to hike more and, to make those overnight trips and turn it into backpacking.
What was your first big, like, okay, I got the gear, I really want to, I want to go for this now? What was like your first big hike?
So the first really big one that I can remember was with my wife before we got married. And we went down to this is an area west of the Shenandoah Valley. It's the Monongahela National Forest, and it's a part of eastern West Virginia that's got true wilderness land in there. Some really amazing microclimates going on in different spaces. And we went down and we did a mountain called North Fork Mountain, and we also did a section of wilderness where we had to actually transport by car a day or so later, called Otter Creek Wilderness. And when I refer to wilderness, what I'm talking about are areas with no signs. There's no equipment allowed back there. There's definitely blazed trails, but typically you just have rock cairns, which are piled rocks, to mark where you might have to cross a creek or look out for a fork in the trail. So, in case something gets overgrown, you're aware that, hey, there might be a change in the path here. So that was our first big trip. It ended up being kind of stressful getting out of Otter Creek because my wife and I bid on more than we could really chew. And it wasn't lack of planning; it was lack of experience. And and so we came out of that physically exhausted. But I tell everyone to this day that was the hike in the day that I realized that I was going to propose to her. I said,
Oh, wow.
if we could get through this and we were still having a great time together, regardless of feeling kind of sick and overwhelmed and extremely tired, and never once had a bad moment of it as far as the way we related to each other, you found something special there. So it was a great hike and a great backpacking experience, and I like to tell people about it. Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. Yeah, it's not many people have that. I thought you were going to say it was like it was right when I knew, like, oh, I love hiking. I love this extreme form of exercise, but that's way better. That's awesome.
Well, and that definitely came out of it and probably set up, a pattern of me tending to step out, bite off a little bit more than I realized I was biting off, and then coming back pretty darn tired and with blisters and bug bites and everything else. But those trips, I've survived every one, so I call them all good trips still. Yeah.
Yeah, those every time to push the boundary just a little bit more so you can always get better. Like, I've done this one. Now let's, I'm going to add an extra 10 miles or something onto the back end of your hike.
Yeah. There's definitely the times that I look back and go, I don't know. I almost drowned that day, because I was wearing a heavy pack and I fell through a layer of bog and ended over my head with a heavy pack and getting sunk, dragged in.
And this was the North Fork?
That trail, when I fell into that bog was actually just 2 years ago. My wife and I have been married for over 20 years now, but years ago on a trip with my son, and we were just kind of diverting off a trail and thought we were on solid ground, and I busted through a patch of
you cut out
all around me. Luckily, my son was there; he was able to pull me out. If I was solo hiking that one, I truly question whether or not I would have came back. Yeah.
Wait, right before you were about to tell the story, you actually cut out your internet cut out and it went completely silent, and I missed the whole thing. Okay. But we can edit through that if you want to go ahead and run it back. I don't want people to miss out on it.
Yeah. So that trip was down into Otter Creek, and again, it's a lot of different environments in there, and one of them was a very large bog that we needed to either cut across or go around. And we thought for certain, because we had strong footing going into it, that we would maintain just kind of walking on squishy ground. And what I ended up walking across was like sheets of sod that then had an unknown depth of water beneath. Wow. And I know that there was at least 6 feet of water because I fell through the sod, busted through, just took one step, planted into it. And like within, a moment, I'm suddenly water over my head and rushing into my pack and into my boots and, thinking, how the heck am I ever going to get out of this? And I had a hiking pole that I got just a little bit of purchase by, if he hadn't been there, when I say sometimes biting off more than I expected, that was one of those moments. And I don't think any amount of preparation would have gotten me out if I was solo. So I really do prefer to do the longer trips with people anyways because of the social aspects. But in that case, just having someone with me, it probably really did save my life.
So when you do go, like you said, you've gone with your son and your wife. Now, do you have like a normal group of people that you go with, or do you? I know you just said you don't really prefer to do it alone, but when you go, what's like your standard crew?
So my standard crew, if I'm just hiking, it's typically my wife and my son. We're talking day hikes. They're going to do anything with me that are what I would call, moderate to a little bit longer days where we're walking maybe 6 to 12 miles or more. And then my wife tends to drop off of those hikes around the 12-mile mark, and it's just my son and I. He's a cross-country runner, much better physical condition than myself, and he can really handle it. My wife, I bet she could handle it, but at that point, she's like, okay, it's just a bit much for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got 2 daughters. They do the short hikes with us, but really, I think
nice.
6 miles is too much for them. They're like, Dad, we're on the trail too long. I want to go do something else.
Yeah, you just get bored. They're like, all right, we got to.
Yeah, but for me, at 6 miles, my legs are warmed up, and I'm enjoying the day at that point. I don't want to leave the woods or wherever we're at,
Yeah, when it's really your thing, and you're like, oh, 6 miles, like we're just getting started, and they're probably like, oh, Dad.
Yeah,
maybe we're just getting started.
Yeah, I've got a buddy I went to high school with too. He goes along with us on several different adventures, and we keep up to this day. And a lot of times when I see him, it's just so we can go out and do a day hike, or he'll occasionally go and do some backpacking with us. So that's really it. I don't like huge groups in the backcountry. I don't want all that noise. It becomes a different element too with managing time and resources when you have that many people. I think the only exception I would make on that rule for myself is if I was with a group of scouts, because I have done a bit of scout leading and things like that. And I've been around a lot of Boy Scouts, and they're really great kids in most cases, and they know how to handle themselves in the backcountry. And so I enjoy the time that we have had in those kind of cases. Yeah. But typically, I want small groups.
Did your son do the Scouts and the Young Marines like you did, or no?
No, he followed kind of a different path. He did a little bit of Cub Scouts, and then got out, and then he got back into Boy Scouts for a while, and then he got out again. It was maybe about a year and a half ago. So he didn't Eagle, but he learned a lot from them, and it really was a great program. It didn't fit his exact lifestyle and what he wanted to do, and he wanted to get more into sports and just follow some other stuff. Yeah.
So when you're looking at like longer hikes, multiple days, and you're going deep into the woods, what's like your best tips for route planning if there's not necessarily a like marked trail, if that makes sense?
Sure. But most parks, especially most people don't realize it in the metro parks, you can go off the trails, unless you're in an area that specifically says these trees or plants are being protected because they really are trying to protect some sort of wildlife right in that zone. Most of the time, you really can't just go off the trail pretty much anywhere. There's some national parks that won't let you do it, and they'll say, no, you must stay on the permitted trails. And it's because of overuse, and it's because of fragile ecosystems. But some of the best places for doing that are in our Forest Service lands. And that you can typically get topographical maps for. These are maps that are available directly through the Forest Service websites, or you sometimes have to order them by mail, but they're almost all on websites now, available for free. You don't have to pay for them. You can download PDFs, and then you can take those topographical maps and then take them to a local print shop that can print on like waterproof paper. You just roll it up, and you got your own custom map in your backpack, and you can take it out with you if it rains. You get dunked in a creek, whatever it is, it's going to hold up. It won't be like a little paper map. And quite honestly, I've got some that are 12 years old and they're still in great shape. The only reason I would ever think of replacing them is if a route changed or the Park Service has made system-wide changes, and I'm like, okay, I got to have the newest edition of that trail map. So that's kind of where I start, is by grabbing those maps. I tend to not use any sort of guidebooks because the guidebooks are almost always about going to on pre-planned trips, on pre-planned trails, and they're very specific about what trail junctions they want you to turn at. And I don't like those type of books because they're harder for me as a person who wants to pick my own trail and decide what I want to see throughout the day or try to accomplish. you kind of have to decipher and pull out pieces. They're not real specific about which between each trail section and where these link up. So I really do prefer to just read maps, maybe take some advice off of blogs or from, in a lot of cases, like Facebook. Even if you're looking at a specific forest area, there might be a Facebook group where someone's like, hey, go and check out, northeast corner of this, above this ridge. It's a great place. And they might give hints on how to get there. And then, you just need to know how to read the map, the lines of inclination and declination, so you can tell, hey, what's going to be a really steep area, or where might I be able to get water, once I run out along my route, or what's going to look like a good area to camp in, if you need to plan out where you're staying overnight. And a lot of times those lines on the map will draw you a pretty good picture of, is it going to be really hilly or steep, or is it going to be pretty flat there? And of course, whether or not that water is available, which for me, I almost never will plan a campsite unless I'm within at least half a mile of water. And I almost always just put them right next to water, because I'm a big believer in filtering water, and I need to have access to, to be able to fill up a pretty large filter bag that I carry and, carry it back to camp, and maybe do that more than once, depending on what I'm cooking or how much cleaning I have to do.
Oh, that's interesting. So would you say that using a topographical map is kind of for somebody who's more of a skilled hiker? Like if somebody really didn't know and they grab a topographical map and they're like, I'm going to use this, to make sure I stay on track. But if you don't necessarily know how to read it, would it prove to be more difficult if you kind of got out in the middle of somewhere and you're like, I'm not as well versed at reading this as somebody else might be?
So I would never go out in the woods with only a topographical map and hope to do backcountry navigation if I really didn't know how to do that. And I almost never do that, because honestly, even the people that are really good at it, once you get under a forest canopy, if you try to do things like triangulation off of a map and you're looking for points that are out in the distance to try to figure out where you are on a piece of, two-dimensional paper, it's really hard to do when you've got a tree canopy hanging over you, even when you're really good at it, because you just can't see these different points that you would want to be able to find yourself using. Mm-hmm. So someone without any experience, no. I mean, there's so many great trails available out there and great paths that have already been tread. They can go out and get a great backcountry without having to bushwhack and do all of that kind of stuff, and really just have a lot of fun. And honestly, that's probably an extra level of stress most people don't need on their first trip. They're going to still probably be figuring out their gear and what they do and they don't like and how they prefer to hike, because there's different methods to even how you walk on a trail when you start to break down the science of it. So so definitely for a beginner, get a good map, get an understanding what the trail is, carry a compass in your pocket, a real compass, not one on a watch or anything that requires a battery or just runs out of battery. You're going to want something real in your pocket. And you always want to have in the back of your mind, where's that best exit point? Is there a highway 10 miles to the north that if you really had to gut it out over 3 days, you just keep going north until you have just that backup exit plan in your mind for if you really get lost, if you travel in a specific direction, you'll either hit a waterway or a roadway and you'll be able to find somebody that way.
Do you always have one of those? Like that backup exit plan is that's like a staple of your hiking trips?
Yeah. And I think that came from that experience with the young Marines where they were teaching about survival mentality. Mm-hmm. And it's not to mean that I'm no survivor, man. I'm not going to ever be able to do what those guys do on some of those pretty far out programs, and I'm not about trapping mice under rocks to eat them and that kind of stuff.
Right.
But that did plant good seeds, and anybody that wants to do that backcountry kind of navigation, I should say there are groups in our area in Northeast Ohio, and I'm sure around the rest of the country, that often will teach that skill absolutely for free to people that want to learn. So looking up orienteering on a Google search would probably help somebody connect to that pretty easily. An orienteering class or a course, because sometimes they call them courses where they'll set you out on a pre-designated course that'll teach you how to do that. Yeah, it's definitely a really great skill. Or find a scout. Ask a Boy Scout; he'll show you how to do it.
Yeah, that's I'm sure there's some people out there who listen to this podcast who definitely would find great interest in that kind of. That's like the if all else fails, like if I'm out here and, something really terrible has happened and I'm on my own, like I might need to know how to trap field mice underneath a rock and build those style of traps.
Yeah. You're right. Some of those basic survival skills really could come in handy for truly, people have been lost in very small areas of park because they really couldn't find their way out. And, you get stuck in a place and you're uncomfortable for a few days. And depending on your general health, you may need to find a way to drink water or to eat that'll at least keep you alive until someone finds you.
So what's like something that, and I know we went through, you fell through the bog and that was pretty traumatic experience, but is there any other times that you've had when something kind of unexpected has occurred and you kind of had to deal with it in real time?
Yeah. And actually, this is also an example of, it's an example of bad pre-planning. So my son and I were headed down, and I talk about West Virginia a lot because I absolutely love it down there, and there's such a variety of experiences. But we were headed down there for just like a 3-day trip, and actually it's going to be a 4-day trip. And we're going down, and on the way I realized I'd forgotten my flashlight, and I normally carry a headlamp, and the battery in that thing will last me like a week. So one set of batteries is fine. And he says, yeah, well, I've got a headlamp with me. And I'm like, well, let's stop at a couple places. So we stopped at like 2 gas stations, and nobody had any sort of flashlight whatsoever. But I was thinking in the back of my mind, we're not staying up late. We pretty much plan on making camp, going to bed, So one flashlight between just me and my son. Hey, we can share that. We'll be fine. We ended up, yeah, we jinxed it. We ended up climbing this one section of mountain and had a storm pull in on us about an hour before sundown. So we estimated we were probably only about 20 minutes away from the campsite that we were hoping to make it to, because in this area of wilderness we were in, we don't want to try to make new campsites. We're going to try to use old, so we don't put the extra burden on the ground and scar the land. So we went up, had heavy cloud canopy, heavy tree coverage, and started to sprinkle. And we looked around and said, you know what, this might be an okay spot to camp in, just in a pinch. And we had some hammocks, so we didn't need flat ground. We could camp over top of rocks, just between a couple of trees. And we debated it. We said, you know what, let's push on, because the other site is supposed to be really pretty. Let's go try to get to this other site. Well, a storm comes in, and it's just torrential rain, and it's beating down on everything. And we're in essentially a section of forest that has the high tree canopy, but also has a bunch of mid-growth that are wild rhododendron. And people think of rhododendrons as these really pretty flowers in the garden. But what we found for the next day and a half, because of that decision, was that rhododendron can make life absolutely hell for you. And we proceeded to climb up the side of this mountain, and these rhododendron bushes were all collapsing in underneath the weight of the rain coming down on the branches. Mm-hmm. The trail absolutely disappeared from underneath of us. We went back and forth, but we had a general idea of where we were, and I said, okay, let's push on. I think if we just get over this next ridge, but because the rock and ground under us was very uneven, it was not trail or flat, and it was all on some sort of hill. And as it's getting darker and darker, and we're just like in these brambles of branches that are just slapping us and beating us around, I realize it's going to be pitch black in about 25 minutes, if less. And we've got 2 hammocks that we've never set up. We better at least find 2 trees or 3 trees that we could string between. So we could share one tree for one end of our hammocks, and then, use 2 other independent trees. But with hammocks, you got to make sure the trees are a specific distance apart or within a given range, because you've only got so much rope or tie off on each end of that hammock. So it can't be too short between the trees or too long, or your hammock won't have enough to suspend you, or you can't connect to them. So here we are, and it's getting darker and darker. And I'm like, Dan, you're going to have to get out that headlight. We finally found our trees. Still can't see the ground, at least at this point, below calf level. So we're just stumbling around and trying to stand upright as we're pulling stuff out of our packs. And he finds his flashlight, and I'll be darned if it wasn't broken. And the only way we could keep this headlamp lit is if he held it in his hand a specific way and put a certain type of pressure on the back panel of it. So yeah, I should have found a way to get one of those darn flashlights before we headed out there. And here it is. It's flashing on and off. We are in an area with copperheads and with rattlesnakes, which luckily it was cool. It was raining. It was probably about the time of day they might be out, but we weren't in an area that they would likely be at that exact moment. And we were really just like, scrambling to try to set up these hammocks. And as the lights are flashing on and on, the rain is coming down. We finally get up a couple tarps, and it takes us no less than 45 minutes in this like pitch darkness. We're shivering, and we finally get the hammocks hung up, and we're in them, and we're like just eating. And we finally just turn off the flashlight. We're sitting there eating in the dark, and all you can hear is the rain and us munching through bags of food and trying not to make a mess, but but the big part of making a mess isn't because we didn't want to, get a couple crumbs on the ground. It's because we didn't want to leave something on the ground that would scent for the bears, because we were
Yeah.
truly within 200 yards of a bear sanctuary. No fences. They just, there's a line on the map that says, yeah, by the way, on this side, of the hill is a bear sanctuary. So we don't want anything that smells like food outside of these scent-proof pouches that we have. And unfortunately, we made a mess. Yeah, so that night was pretty overwhelming. And the next day, we spent a good 7 hours fighting our way down the side of the mountain because we never found the trail again until we fought through these rhododendron thickets coming all the way down the side of this mountain. And we were out of water, and we couldn't find any more water. And I was extremely dehydrated, and we were both very hot. And yeah, that was, it's all a matter of just, improper planning, didn't have the right equipment, and then we pushed on when we could have said, you know what, the rain's starting to fall, and we don't really know this area too well. We should just stop and, be happy with where we are. We would have had a much more pleasant 4-day experience.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, that was, it was kind of harrowing at points. Yeah.
But it makes for a great story. Then
Yeah.
now you've got the tale to tell, which is cool.
Yeah.
That's a cool, and you got to do it with your son, which is pretty awesome.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and there were moments along that, you find the rewards in that, like waking up in a canopy that we never got to see in full light, and we're hanging at the level of the tops of these rhododendron bushes and watching birds flying all around us at the break of dawn, and this like mist rising up out of the woods. And we did hear a rattler down below us at one point in the night, so some of them were going past us. But it was so rewarding to be in that peaceful calmness. And like there was no trail, there was no campsite around us. All we could make out was this vague trail that we had like stumbled through in the dark the night before. It was just wonderful, actually. It was a really great experience.
So you'd mentioned that when you were setting up the hammocks, that you were shivering a little bit. Like what's your tactic if you are like your body temperature's dropping, you're kind of in a scenario like that? What do you do to keep warm in that sense?
Yeah, so a lot of what my thermal management when out in the field is all about layers, so I try to have lightweight wicking layers that I can throw, fleece and other layers, and then ultimately something that's going to block wind and rain on the top of all that. And in that case, and actually even summertime, we'll carry out like a beanie hat, like a winter, going out for sled riding beanie hat. And just to give you that extra warmth, in case maybe you're laying on the ground at night, the ground's kind of cold and it's sapping your body energy. If you keep your head warm, that'll make a big difference. Keep your head and your feet warm and make a big difference. So that layering's really important. And in that moment, I was more concerned with getting my son and I up off the ground and into a dry space than I was. I wasn't so worried about hypothermia, which can happen on a 60-degree night if you're soaked and chilled. But hypothermia wasn't first and foremost. It was more of, let's try to find something that we can actually relax our bodies on, because there was no ground, there was nothing to lay down, sit down on. We had to get suspended in these hammocks, or else we had no chance of any sort of comfort in getting new energy into our bodies, which was also going to be an additional, source of warmth for us, is to actually get fresh carbohydrate into us. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So with like you said, you were near the bear sanctuary and you heard the rattlers. Have you ever had an encounter with wildlife?
So I've seen black bear several times on the trail, and I have actually, my son and wife and his girlfriend, she went with us on a couple night backpacking trip last summer, and we finally saw, like, I always hear the snakes, but I never get to see them. I saw what had to be at least a 6.5 foot long rattlesnake, and it was huge. And I was in this clearing and we were eating our lunch and just kind of enjoying the middle of the day, and look over it, and it just came out of the tree line like, hey, this is my spot, just stay back. It didn't seem to be bothered we were there. It would rattle, but it kept coming in our direction, and we moved out of its way and let it get into the sunny spot that it wanted. That was pretty awesome. One time we were coming down out of a place called Paintbrush Canyon, which is up in the Grand Tetons. Mm-hmm. And we had just been up there walking around on some ice and snow. It was beginning of July, and the divides still weren't melted out, but we came down out of there, and it was maybe an hour before dark, and my son was hiking ahead of me on a really narrow trail where to the left it was all like thorny brush, and to the right was basically a rock wall, and the trail was maybe about 3 feet wide. And I'm expecting bear because there was lots of bear sightings that summer in the Tetons, and they're running around all over the place out there. So I'm expecting to come down and maybe we're going to see a bear finally. And he stops and pivots, and his eyes are gigantic in his head. And he's like, he goes, it's not a bear. And I'm like, what is it? He goes, I kind of push him to the side and look around him. And there's like this 8-foot tall moose on the trail.
Oh
and
my
its
gosh.
backside was facing us. And we're maybe only like 5-6 feet from it from the way we came around this corner. And immediately I'm thinking, we have no place to go because moose do what hippopotamus do. They trample people. They're some of the most dangerous animals to actually get close to in the wild. They're like buffalo. They'll just run you right over. And that's what I'm thinking. I can't go into, I was thinking that was my only option, was to go into these thorny brush because I can't climb the rocks to my side here. And I'm thinking we're going to get all shredded here in just a moment, and trying to hopefully not get trampled. And sure enough, it looks back at us and it keeps chewing, and it slowly takes about 7 steps off the trail and looks back at us like, all right, dummies, go before I do decide to run you over. And I had to. I reached in, I pulled out my camera, and I got a couple shots of this moose. It was iconic pictures of a moose in the woods. I was thrilled. We got past it, and that was just a really, really cool moment to be that close to a huge animal. And yeah, it was just a really cool time. We actually did get our picture from it too. I think the other animal that's been really cool to be around have been marmot. And marmot are like groundhogs, but I'd say they've got more personality. They're kind of bigger. They come up to you in a lot of cases because they're not necessarily afraid of us. They typically will play around with your equipment first. We've had them chew on hiking poles and try to get into backpacks and stuff. And these are big animals. And they there was one day we were hiking out of a place called Bomber Mountain that is up in the Wind River range of Wyoming. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life. Absolutely, like, heartbreakingly gorgeous in there. Very remote. And we were coming out of this campsite. We'd been able to camp overnight. Nobody else around us at this lake, totally isolated. And the next morning, we're hiking back up the side of this mountain to get back out. And in this big field, these marmot are running to either side of us on the trail. And they look like, if you've ever been on a boat or seen how dolphins will follow boats,
Oh yeah.
they were like hopping through the weeds along beside us, and they looked like little land dolphins just jumping through the woods and you're tramping through the high brush. They're just they're neat animals, and we don't see that here. Yeah, we don't see that out here. Yeah, yeah.
When you passed the moose, so how close were you to it at the very closest point when you had to pass it?
Well, when we first saw it, it was the closest point, and then it did step off the trail. I would say about 10 feet off the trail.
Okay.
So we never felt like, okay, we're in the clearing until we finally really got to walk past it, and after hearing all the stories of them trampling people, and by no means am I trying to encourage anybody to have a close encounter with a moose, but I really thought we were, going to be in for something with more of a lot worse story. And when it turned around and just looked at us, and it was chewing on its food, and it just had this look on her face like, all right, guys, just get going. It was fun. Yeah.
Yeah. I've always wondered, like, I'll be walking through the woods if, we decide to go on a hike or something like that. And like, what would I actually do if you come face to face with a bear or something like that? Because I know that there's the rhyme, isn't there? Like, of depending on what kind of bear, what species of bear it is, what you're supposed to do. But like, as a human being, when you'd see it and fear sets in, I think that stuff goes out the window if you're not an experienced outdoorsman and you are going to run. You're going to think, I can get away from this animal. But it's weird. It's like, I still don't know the answer of what I would actually do when you're like, because you can't recreate that feeling of probably sheer terror that's coursing through your body when that occurs.
You're right. And, and where you can't get experience, you can at least get educated. So, after a lifetime of hearing what to do around black bear, if there's a mama and baby, definitely stay away. Do not make yourself a threat. If it's just one bear or a couple of medium to adult sized bears, make yourself big, make lots of noise. They take off running. It happens every time, unless, there could be extenuating circumstances. I don't want to get somebody killed, but,
right.
But for the most part, every time, they're going to see you or hear you first. Black bear, grizzly bear, other story. If you smell tasty to them, you better be ready to put up a fight or protect yourself or cower. There's a totally different, method with that. Polar bear, you're done if they get that close to you. Yeah, they're extremely aggressive. So, but black bear, yeah, you've got you have a pretty good chance of just scaring them off and probably never seeing the one that was on the trail 2 minutes before you got there.
Yeah, I've always found that interesting, especially the part about the polar bear. Like, obviously, it's the one that you're probably least likely to come into contact with, at least obviously where we live, but unless you do a lot of Arctic outdoor adventures, things like that. But yeah, that's
in any sort of trip like that, when you're going into an area that you don't know the animals and you don't know what you're going to be around, obviously you want a little bit of education about that, so maybe you can appreciate it or know what to expect. In that repetition of reading up on things and getting an idea about that specific area you're in, because we could talk about, you'll get an idea of what those animals are, keep it fresh in your mind, think about it a few times, and more than likely, I'm betting that if you do the right type of homework, and you really had some level of awareness, your brain's going to pull the detail out that you. But it's giving yourself that little bit of repetition in that information, not just reading it once and going, okay, yeah, there's bears and whatever. Taking it a little bit serious, probably go a long ways to helping you have that moment of clarity and do the right thing.
Oh, absolutely. All right, in an effort to build the suspense, we're gonna call this part 1. And I thank you so much for coming and talking to us and hanging out. And we'll get you back on and we'll fire up part 2, and that's going to be all about drinking water, potable water, food sources, what you take with you, all that good stuff. So thank you again for coming and for talking to us.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks, Nick.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That's part 1 of the hiking basics with our friend Fred. I hope you really enjoyed it. We are going to have a part 2 here pretty soon, hopefully next week. And we get into the food he takes with him, what he prefers, water purification, crack some myths even, and we talk about the trips he has coming up. He's got a really cool one coming up that we talked about a little bit, and we get into all that. So, but before we go, I want to shout out our friends at Valley Food Storage. They have clean, nutritious, healthy, long-term food storage options for people like Fred and anybody else who is just in the survival space. To listen to this podcast, you can take 15% off your next order with the code PRACTICAL15 at checkout.